No series about who rules America can leave out Wall Street's financial clout. We've left its impact for last, secure in the knowledge that in today's America, this financial district is a key power center, a hub for the financialization of an economy in which the control of big money is often central to the control of politics and society. We have spoken with a respected corporate executive who told us point blank that the rich now rule America.
My personal opinion is a large part of what's happening economically is due to basically globalization and digitization of business. That can't be stopped.
Professor Stanley Aronowitz quotes the famous sociologist C. Wright Mills on the same theme from 50 years ago.
Wall Street, the financial sector, is the leading edge of corporate capital. And it was a leading edge of corporate capital in the mid-50s. Of course, today it's much more accentuated because of the relative decline of industrial corporations.
I've heard things that'll blow your mind, and now I think it's time you get the whole story.
Many Americans see all this as a conspiracy by an unaccountable secret cabal that operates like a power center beyond democratic control. The internet is filled with videos about shadowy billionaires and their plots to control everything.
Which is ongoing right now. It is a conspiracy of institutional corruption from the highest level.
From international bankers to the super rich, from Washington to Rome, they're all in it together. And when
is Wall Street a conspiracy? And what role does it play in who rules America? Is it an outside job or an inside job?
It's not a matter of elites outside the state, although of course they have enormous influence, but the reason they have enormous influence is because the state is structured to be reproducing their power and authority in the society.
Leo Panitch, he's an economist and analyst, and I think he offered a perspective that we really haven't heard before. He's sort of fighting against the conspiratorial idea, that there's a small group of people in a room somewhere running things. He's talking about the structure of the society, the values of it, who really runs things. Wall Street is not only a place, it's an industry with thousands of interconnected firms that call themselves a financial services industry. But they are much more than that. They are deeply involved with how our country is run, says Robert Weissman, the head of the public interest group, Public Citizen.
Well, you can't understand what's happened in the country in the last 30 years in terms of economic policy and really the way the country's evolved politically without understanding how Wall Street has grown in power. It's grown in economic power and it's grown in political power, and that's been synergistic. They use their political power to wipe out a whole range of regulations that control them.
In the past, investors would buy stocks in real companies and industries that generated jobs, provided services, or created products of value. Those days are gone.
They became a bigger and bigger portion of the economy.
Then we went from an economy of production, making things, to one based on consumption, buying and selling things. Consumers soon drove 70% of the economy as banks, private equity companies, and hedge funds grew in size.
As they became a bigger portion of the economy, they were able to leverage more and more political power in a really horrible cycle for the functioning of democracy. And what that led us up to, of course, was the crash in 2008.
So consumers went deeper and deeper into debt. And then bankers bought and sold debt while they changed the rules regulating their activities.
A whole series of deregulatory moves that had been enabled by the political influence of Wall Street led to the actual functioning of the economy to be a disaster.
Because as billionaire investor George Soros told me years ago, the capitalist economy is also inherently unstable and prone to bubbles and crashes.
I've worked with the theory that financial markets are inherently unstable. And to prevent excesses, you need some kind of intervention, supervision, regulation. Unfortunately, the prevailing idea is that markets tend towards equilibrium. And so we work with a false concept of how financial markets operate.
Well, we were told by someone, for example, that the beauty of globalization is that no one is in control.
Well, there is a great advantage in that because controls have their own problems. In fact, markets are much more efficient than centralized controls. But it doesn't mean that there should be absolutely no control. And in fact, if you look at reality, ever since you've had capitalism and ever since you have had financial markets, you have had crises. And each time there was a crisis, there was something done to prevent a recurrence.
The problem this time is the dramatic surge in debt. Look at this. These are charts showing the debt of the United States, page after page, illustrating how much money is owed. It's mind-boggling. It gets even more complicated when you start talking about new financial instruments like derivatives that have turned the industry into a global casino. Derivatives can also be used as insurance, betting that a loan will or won't default before a given date. They become the basis of a big betting system, like in a casino. Financial journalist Max Kaiser says just a handful of big financial firms now dominate the industry and the global economy.
Without a doubt, there's JP Morgan, which is in bed with the Fed into the central banking system.
Wall Street bets on future values and the performance of practically everything of value.
So you've got Morgan, Goldman Sachs are the two primary players in this global financialized world.
Soon, CEOs, financiers, and executives of a small number of investment banks and hedge funds became rich and powerful by controlling specialized high-stakes markets.
They are connected to the central banking system, which is the Fed, the ECB. The Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland is kind of the central bank of the central banks. These are the folks that are keeping, their main purpose at this point is to keep interest rates as close to zero as possible, to make it as cheap as possible for people who are borrowing money to speculate, to be able to speculate freely without having to pay for the money that they're borrowing to speculate.
Even if these financial markets are supposedly open to all, a relatively few traders, investors, and asset managers came to structure the markets to increase their own wealth and power.
And if they ever make a bad bet, then they quickly move to cover their bad bets with austerity programs or some kind of bailout program or a quantitative easing program.
A Swiss study by physicists on the ownership and control of stock exchanges in 48 countries examined 24,877 stocks and 106,141 shareholding entities. To their amazement, they found that just 10 companies were dominating all stock ownership. Here they are. When we talk about money and we talk about Wall Street, we have to ask this question: where does the money come from that's used in the speculation in our financial markets? This man knows, Barry James Dyke. He's an asset manager and he works with clients. So where does it come from?
The money comes from people's savings, regular old savings, people's retirement funds, which is saving for retirement.
But do the people who put their money into these accounts know how it's being invested or spent?
They don't have a clue.
It's only now, as a result of the financial crisis, that the public is learning slowly that the self-styled masters of the universe on Wall Street speculated on risky investments and created a crash. Graydon Carter, the editor of Vanity Fair, wrote, "It can fairly be said that the chain of catastrophic bets made over the past decade by a few hundred bankers may well turn out to be the greatest nonviolent crime against humanity in history. They brought the world's economy to its knees, lost tens of millions of people their jobs and their homes, and crashed the retirement plans of a generation. And they could drive an estimated 200 million people worldwide into dire poverty." In 2010, before Occupy Wall Street, labor unions were marching to protest Wall Street crimes.
29th of April. This is a march on Wall Street organized by the AFL-CIO, which says they've organized 200 protests so far, but you never know it in terms of the media coverage. Well, today, the media is out, and they're marching because of a theft. Millions of jobs are missing, 11 million jobs, according to the AFL-CIO. They want payback. They want Wall Street to pay. They want a new tax on financial transactions.
We are trying to recover from a financial crisis that some people say is even worse than the Depression in the 1930s. And yet, reforms that have been proposed, very modest reforms, are being fought tooth and nail at the regulatory level by Wall Street firms and financiers. Do you think that they have a disproportionate power to influence Congress?
There's no doubt about that. Not just the Congress, but state legislatures as well. Their strength, their power runs the entire gambit of the American political system.
I read that the financial services industry had hired 28 lobbyists per member of Congress to try to influence their decisions, to try to inform. What happens to you when lobbyists come into your office to try to get you to vote their way? How does that work, that game?
Well, it's very hard to get a meeting with me. I don't think that they spent a lot of money trying to lobby me. I'm kind of clear on my ideology, clear my view of representative government, and very clear on the Constitution. But suffice it to say, while my district is competitive, there are many more competitive districts than mine. And every member of Congress, to that extent, becomes a prisoner to the election process, to the fundraising process.
Sheila Krumholz of the Center for Responsive Politics says Wall Street's power is well documented.
Wall Street, the banks, and the financial industry writ large is the single largest source of campaign cash in the United States, and it has been for years, if not decades. It is kind of following the Willie Sutton rule of politics. You go where the money is. That's where the money is. They have not just political action committees that can pony up maximum amounts to influential members of Congress who have jurisdiction over their industry, but also they can pony up, pass the hat and pony up hundreds of thousands of dollars just among their partners and vice presidents and executives in their companies.
She says their clout will impact the election in 2012.
So they can muster a ton of money, and this is also seen specifically in the presidential race in 2012, where, of course, Mitt Romney has hailed from the private equity industry, and prior to that, Barack Obama had been the darling of Wall Street. So Wall Street and banks in particular are an enormously influential part of the U.S. industry.
That power is being shown as Wall Street lobbyists try to sabotage financial reforms passed by Congress.
2 years after the passage of the legislation, and are the regulators doing the good things that Congress told them to do? And the answer to a considerable extent is no. They're way behind on issuing the rules that they're supposed to issue. Where they actually have issued the rules are getting challenged in almost every instance in court by the Chamber of Commerce or the Financial Securities Roundtable or other Wall Street interests. And they're having a tough time with a judiciary that's favorable to big business and maintaining the rules that they've issued.
So reforms can be passed, but they can also be sabotaged.
Right. They get multiple bites at the apple. They get a bite in Congress, where they've got enormous power, but at least it's mostly a public fight. And then they go to the regulatory agencies, where they also have enormous power, but it's usually below the radar, off the front pages, and they don't even have the public scrutiny.
Recently, on a radio show I host, I discussed Wall Street power and the financial meltdown with financial journalists Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert, as well as Andy Stepanian, an animal rights activist who led a campaign against a company in the business of painful medical tests on puppies. After his group drove their stock price down, the company went broke, but then the government labeled him a financial terrorist and sent him to prison. We began by comparing Wall Street to the Titanic, the unsinkable ship that sank.
If the Titanic were the story today, the difference would be that Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan would have heavy bets that would pay off when the ship sinks, and Hank Paulson would be down there widening the gash.
It brings me to a new study out just recently, and they looked at hundreds of shipwrecks throughout the past few hundred years. And what they found is that the norm is actually for women and children to die more frequently than men, and that the captain usually didn't go down with the ship. They were usually, their survival rate was the highest.
These guys, they use derivatives, as Warren Buffett calls them, weapons of mass financial destruction, to make situations worse, because their bets that they have on these calamities becoming worse pay off enormously, and we see that in the numbers, in the bonuses. It's reflected.
Andy, you were nodding before when Max was speaking about all of this. Is this really true that they're betting against, us in a sense, betting against, hoping for bad things to happen?
I don't think that everybody that works on Wall Street has this mentality, but there is a culture that's in place where people have learned to at least accept and justify behavior like looking at these investments, betting investments against, things to fail, whether it be a government, whether it be a country, or whether it be a company to fail, and say, oh, well, I can justify this. And you look at it like it's numbers. You don't look at the people behind it. You don't look at the families that suffer. You don't look at the country that suffers as a result.
Well, here's what is mind-boggling to me, is you are presenting a picture of intentionality, that people did things to further their own interests. They knew what they were doing. It was calculated, and yet in most of the media, it seems as if it's presented as some sort of mistake, as miscalculation. Gee, we wanted housing to go up, but it went down. You can't blame us. Everybody was doing it, therefore nobody was doing it, therefore nobody can be prosecuted.
Well, let's assume that there was intention. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Some would argue that it's a good thing to have people who are parasites in an economy, because parasites are useful. I have parasites in my intestines. They perform a useful function. The problem is the parasites don't run my heart, lungs, and brain. In America, the parasites write the regulatory framework that's supposed to be governing them, so the parasites run the show.
Is Wall Street affecting, capital? Is Wall Street affecting our policy making? Well, they're becoming our policy makers, at least for a short period of time, and then returning back to the banks.
So it's a revolving door kind of thing.
Essentially. I mean, they're in and out of whether it be the Bush administration or the Obama administration, the different positions within the cabinet that are governing finance are individuals that are former CEOs of banks, or they might go back to being an honorary chair on the board of directors. It's this incestuous relationship between Wall Street and policymakers.
Sounds so corrupt.
Danny, you asked who runs America, and I say it's ignorance. And Thomas Jefferson warned of this, and that we needed a media who would inform the population, otherwise we would lose our democracy. So this is ignorance that is being forced upon you, criminalizing knowledge.
This is something that I was startled by when NASDAQ opened up, in Times Square, a big studio out front with a big window, and then I said, I'd love to tour the exchange. And this was the time that Bernie Madoff was running NASDAQ, and they said, you can't tour the exchange. There is no exchange. It looks like an exchange. There's a building that says NASDAQ, but the actual operations are computers.
Algorithmic trading goes well beyond that. As you're alluding to, it's not about individuals who are taking any risks personally to make a market as part of a capitalist system. These are computers that have virtually unlimited credit, because the cost of credit is now zero, and the ability for a bank like JP Morgan with a $90 trillion balance sheet of derivatives, they can lend $1 trillion to a computer program to make a bet. If the bet doesn't work, then they get a federal bailout. If the bet works, then they get a bonus. So it's heads they win, tails we lose. And this has been going on now for a number of years, but it's gotten shockingly more disproportionate and asymmetric.
This shift towards super-fast computers is just another example of the deeper shift we've seen in power as finance, in effect, takes over, with politicians courting Wall Street at global conferences and in private meetings, as George Soros explains.
It is actually symptomatic of the age, because you have presidents and prime ministers courting the financiers and the industrialists. So it does show a shift in the relative power. But I don't want to convey. See, I don't believe that business can in any way replace the power of the state, because it's different kind of power. So the sovereignty is still in the hands of the state.
Wall Street, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but Wall Street controls everything, I mean, they're the major shareholders of all the major companies. Look at the BP oil spill. Who is the owner of BP oil spill? The biggest shareholder is JP Morgan. There's so much happening now, there's no stopping what's happening now. The system, everyone knows the system's broken, whether you're a 1%er or a 99%er, a Republican, a Democrat, anarchist, communist, capitalist. Everyone knows the system is broken. So now we need to fix it.
We'll give the last word to a scholar with a longer view, American historian Eric Foner.
I think what we face is a serious democracy deficit, not only in the United States, but in many other countries as well. I'm not quite ready to say a plutocracy determines everything that happens in the United States, but I think the democracy deficit arises from the fact that fundamental issues are now just off limits from democracy. It doesn't matter who is elected. The basic issues about finance, about deindustrialization, things like that are about globalization, about the loss of power of ordinary people over their own lives. That's not open to discussion. I don't care if it's Democrat, Republican, Obama, Romney. That's not part of what their debate is. Their debate is at the margins so that the fundamental issues facing ordinary people are not subject to democratic consideration. Government does not represent the ordinary people. Even though people elect the government does not respond at all to the needs and aspirations of ordinary people.
In this series, we've investigated who rules America, examining the history of deep conflicts in this country going back to the American Revolution. We've dissected the power of the military, corporations, the media, and Wall Street. We have shown that these powerful forces often undermine democracy rather than strengthen it. There is a battle underway for the soul of America, for who rules America, that has put these deeper issues on the agenda. The question, is a fundamental transformation possible, or will special interests and the wealthiest Americans continue to dominate in a country that says it's the most dynamic democracy on earth?
The belief in our democracy is almost an article of religious faith, even though there's a separation of church and state. Perhaps that's why the views you've heard in this series are rejected by the establishment, rejected by academia, rejected by the press. They believe only the people have power if anyone does. But opinion leaders don't look into it. They don't focus on interests, they focus on ideologies, on personalities, not institutions. The idea of a power elite is an anathema to them, because if people believed it, that might spur dissatisfaction and dissent. In the age of the internet and global television, you can't stop people from being exposed to counter-narratives to official myths. These issues are debatable, of course, but most political coverage doesn't debate other ways of looking at the world. It relies on the usual pundits recycling conventional wisdom. They don't ask who rules America.
Members of Congress, I have the high privilege and the distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.